What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Shadowrun Dragonfall. A couple of things right at the start of the video here. I like to review games after 100% because I feel like it sets me apart from other reviewers on YouTube, as well as simply lending me more credibility as a reviewer. In addition to that, a review after 100% covers a wide variety of things, and while it does include the achievements, it is not just the achievements. If you're curious what all of that entails, and you're not subscribed to my channel, if you go to my channel, the first video you're going to see is a video explaining everything that I cover in these reviews. Now, with that out of the way, let's turn our attention to the game itself. Shadowrun Dragonfall is the second game in a trilogy, often referred to as the Shadowrun Trilogy. Now, the game itself is an isometric CRPG from Harebrained Schemes. Interestingly enough, Dragonfall actually started its life as a sort of expansion or DLC to Shadowrun Returns. It was released in February of 2014 as a module that one could play in Shadowrun Returns. However, about 6 months later, it then received its full standalone release as a director's cut, which, in addition to, of course, releasing it as a full game, also added quite a bit of content as well. Now, while I will cover the basic story setup, I'm going to try not to spoil too much in case you want to actually play the game. But the general story setup is that you are a new member to a group of Shadowrunners. In this world, Shadowrunners are basically like mercenaries who do things behind the scenes to just help general people and get paid. In this particular game, we are a member of a group of Shadowrunners in the city of Berlin, Germany. Now, in this current time period that this takes place in, Germany is actually being ruled by what is called the Flux State, which is basically anarchists, just to give you a little bit of background, but we'll go over more of that later. But as the newest member of this team of Shadowrunners, you are with your team on a job. That's where the story starts. That job goes south very quickly, leading your team to discover, and this is a very early on thing, the existence of Firewing. Firewing is a notorious dragon in the Shadowrun universe, but to explain the significance of that, I have to explain a few other things, such as, in the Shadowrun universe, magic exists and is real. However, it is on a 5,200-year cycle. So back in 2012 in this universe, when the world was supposed to end, what actually happened is that magic re-entered the universe, as the world had just gone through its 5,200 years of no magic. So this caused all sorts of problems, but most notably, dragons awoke. Apparently they hibernate through their off-season, so to speak. But one dragon in particular, Firewing, went on a rampage and killed tens of thousands of people before she was eventually shot down. She was presumed dead, though nobody could really prove that. She went down in an incredibly radioactive area, so nobody could really follow up. So your team, at the very beginning of the game, keep in mind, I'm not spoiling anything, this is like the first mission information here. Your team goes in, botches a job because you accidentally, as far as you know, stumbled onto something, which turns out to be, quite probably, the lair of the Firewing. And the story evolves from there as you kind of have to figure out a way to deal with this situation at this point, which is honestly a pretty good intro to the start of a CRPG, especially back in 2014. Now, a few more notes on the story. Without spoiling anything, again, there are 8 endings, or at least I would say 8 distinct ending options, that I would say largely boil down to 3 or 4 different conclusions. There's the terrible bad ending, there is all sorts of neutral endings, and then there is what I would call the good ending, if you will. The good ending, like most true endings, if you will, requires a lot more work and specific options taken throughout the game. But we'll talk a bit more about what kind of choices you can make here in a bit. Now, for character creation, largely the same as Shadowrun Returns, because again, it was based on a module in Shadowrun Returns. But to put it very simply, the game does more with the same system. And where Shadowrun Returns was arguably a fairly low-level adventure, if you want to put it that way, you start out with a lot more karma, which is the experience points in this particular game. So you'll use your karma, spread that around your appropriate attributes, which kind of makes your build. And this being a magic mixed with regular technology universe, you can of course be a mage, someone who uses technology. You can become what is called a decker, which is basically just hacking. You can be someone who specializes in robotics, using a drone in combat, that kind of thing. You can be a shaman who summons spirits and things to the battlefield. There's a lot going on, and it expands on that stuff a lot more than Returns did, and that honestly makes it feel much more like a CRPG. Now, when it comes to the difficulty of the game, I will say the game is more difficult than Shadowrun Returns, but it's not overwhelming or anything. In general, though, enemies will actually use tactics on normal, whereas in Returns it was basically just attack everything until it's dead. Dragonfall takes a much more tactics approach, as well as enemies just not being so dense. They will actually use things like grenades and abilities that rob you of your AP, your action points. And that's just on normal compared to normal for both of those games. So with all that said, let's jump into the world building a little bit. Now, world building in Dragonfall functions quite a bit differently from the first game. Whereas the first game is a fairly linear path, the world building of Dragonfall sees you taking on missions from a central hub. So this central hub is kind of like your neighborhood, the area that you are in charge of. And after the botched job at the very beginning of the game, your character is put in charge of your team of Shadowrunners, which kind of inadvertently puts you sort of in charge of this neighborhood. Now, through most of the game, you can tackle missions largely in any order you want. There are story-critical missions that have to be done, and then there's all sorts of optional missions. These missions can largely be unlocked by talking to characters throughout the central hub area. This is especially true of your companions, as this game actually has proper companions. There are 4 of them, and 3 of those companions will have a story mission unlocked if you talk to them in between missions. So go out on a mission, come back, and then talk to all your companions. They'll open up to you more. Eventually, they'll give you a side mission to complete. Now, that's true for 3 out of the 4. 1 of the 4, their side mission is directly tied to one of the main missions, which makes it much easier to do, frankly. In addition to talking to everyone throughout your central hub, you're of course going to find all sorts of shops for things like consumables, armor, weapons, medical, cyberware. And a couple of notes on those shops are that, 1, there are a lot more items, which leads to a lot more build variety, if you want to call it that, for this particular game. There are a lot more weapon types. For instance, you can use sniper rifles, that kind of thing. You can buy different kinds of magic. And you can even buy different types of cyberware. Cyberware, in my opinion, probably saw the biggest amount of variation from the first game. But what's more, depending on your exact build, you're probably going to buy most of your equipment from one character, as each of the shops around kind of caters to one specific build type, be that somebody who uses like weapons or just melee versus ranged attacks, or someone who likes to use tech such as hacking, or someone who uses drones, etc. And then there's the magic shop, which your shamans or your mage characters would go use. And those shops are also where those particular characters will go to find armor appropriate for their class. And then we have the Cyberware Shop. Cyberware is an interesting one. It primarily benefits people who are not magic users, as installing cyberware will lower your essence, which lowers your spell slots, which makes you less effective at using magic. So typically speaking, a magic user is going to use, at most, a very tiny amount of cyberware, whereas somebody who's not casting magic can go all in on the cyberware and become a bit of a powerhouse in a different way. I played the game both ways. I honestly found both of them to be pretty satisfying. Personally, I think I preferred the mage or spellcaster route myself. Now, when it comes to leaving your central hub to go on a mission, you'll basically go to the train station and you'll board a train and you'll launch your missions from there, with the idea being that you're taking a train to the mission, or the appropriate place that the mission will happen. And this is where you are going to be able to pick your gear and your layout, what consumables you're taking with you, as well as what companions you're taking with you. Because typically speaking, you can only have 4 people going on a mission, and you have yourself plus 4 companions, and if you don't like a particular companion, or if you want to bring a particular type of character with you, there are other mercenaries around your neighborhood that can also be brought along on your missions. And, depending on your choices, you might actually wind up with 1 or 2 characters to also take with you on missions potentially as well. All of which have strengths and weaknesses and can bring different things to the mission with you, because if your character lacks skills in a particular thing, typically speaking, in a lot of cases, a character with those skills can instead do that task for you. Now that's sort of how the world building works on a mechanical level, but for the rest of it, as I mentioned earlier, Berlin is largely ruled by what is called the flux state. Now there are still corporations, people in power, questionable experiments. You're going to see all of that stuff, but there's not like a proper police force at the moment, which leads to all sorts of shady groups And all of this is colored by the terror of Firewing. As you play through the game, you learn more about Firewing and the destruction that she wrought when she woke up and went on rampages, destroying whole cities, and again, killing tens of thousands of people over the span of a few months, before she was eventually taken down. And what Dragonfall, I think, does a lot more than Returns did, is expand upon the world, especially dragons and their role in this world, and what their absence might entail. So on the world building front, I will say they do a fantastic job of laying the world out for you in terms of interacting with it and learning about it, as well as subjects such as dragons and high magic and what happens when these things could potentially be gone. Are there implications to those things? And last but not least, on the world building front, there are a lot of stat and skill checks. Pretty much any way you build a character, you're probably going to see some sort of stat or skill check. However, I will say these tend to be a bit more weighted in favor of charisma and decking. Decking is basically just hacking, but they call it decking in the future of Shadowrun, apparently. Those two options, decking and charisma, in my opinion, they see a lot more use than all the other skills, though all of the skills are represented. And with that, let's talk combat a little bit. Now, combat is a turn-based action system, so every turn you will get to move your entire team, which I always like. I think that makes combat feel a little more interesting in terms of turn-based combat, and it doesn't feel like you're just waiting for your turn all the time. However, each individual character will get a set number of actions. Now, some actions, like throwing a grenade, might cost 2 actions instead of 1. But if you're using, like, say, a melee weapon, typically speaking, moving to the target and attacking it is included as 1 action. But that said, combat, just coming straight from Returns, is much improved. We actually see the addition of action bars, which leads to a lot more abilities that we can then use, of course, in combat, which makes combat feel a little more tactical as opposed to just the attack everything that we saw in Returns. You can also even use the environment a bit to your advantage. Shamans can actually summon spirits here and there throughout the game from the environment. Deckers will often be able to hack into things mid-combat, which will allow them to take control of turrets and things through the Matrix. The Matrix is sort of a physical representation of the internet, if you will, and Deckers will navigate this with their deck, which is why they're called Deckers. And using various programs, etc., they can hack things in real time as you are in combat, which makes them pretty interesting. But overall, I would say combat in this particular one gives each archetype a bigger opportunity to shine, either through weapon variants or new abilities added. I actually played through the game a few different times, 2 full playthroughs and a couple of shorter playthroughs just to check around with some of the classes. And each of them kind of has their moments to shine. Now, when it comes to enemy tactics, as I mentioned earlier, enemies are just generally smarter. They will use things like grenades, etc. against you. If you're all clumped up together, they will actively use abilities to try to take your action points away, that kind of thing. But moreover, something that will come up in combat a few times throughout this game is that sometimes there's just too much of it, frankly. Oftentimes you'll find yourself infiltrating a place just to have to then fend off waves of enemies before an objective completes. And this happens multiple times throughout the game, and frankly, some of it just takes too long, because oftentimes you'll have to fight things on your way to an objective, get to an objective, fend off waves of enemies, and then fight even more enemies on your way out the door. And while I will say a charisma character can help alleviate some of this, even with a charisma character, there is just tons of this combat. There were several moments in missions where it was just like, are they really just still throwing waves of enemies at you? And it gets to be a little much, honestly. I think if they had scaled back the combat just a bit, it would have flowed a bit more naturally, in my opinion. But that brings us to the companions. First up, we have Elgar, a female troll. She is former military. She uses a sniper rifle as well as a shotgun, so typically just a ranged character. Then we have Glory. Glory is a cyberwared up combat medic. She is just covered in old cyberware, and she is often taking on the role of healer as well as using special claw weapons through her cyberware that she gets. She can also be a very good melee character. Then we have Blitz. Blitz is your decker. Should you yourself choose not to be a decker, you will likely be using Blitz, as deckers in this game are quite important, and having someone to hack things with you is a very important thing to do if you can't do it yourself, so Blitz will likely be with you quite often. He himself is a former gang member who is now using his skills to help you after you helped him out of a tight spot. And then last but not least, we have Dietrich. Dietrich is a former punk rock band frontman who is also a shaman. Shaman in this world connect to a totem or a spirit from beyond the world or the plane of existence that we live in. Dietrich's totem, the Dragon Slayer, pushes him to be rowdy, basically, and kind of stand up to things and take on fights against larger opponents, that type of general thinking. So Dietrich himself, pretty cool. He's a largely support caster in that he has abilities that will increase your aim, increase your action points per turn, that type of stuff. Now, each of these companions, as you go through the game, are going to level up a few times, and with each level up, they will potentially bring new weapons or abilities with them in combat. Some of that is set in stone, and some of it you can actually choose yourself. As they hit certain milestones, you can pick between two abilities for them. And, as I mentioned earlier, they all have companion storylines. I think Glory, Aegir, and Dietrich all had very good stories. I didn't really like Blitz's so much, because he's supposed to be your hacker extraordinaire if you chose yourself not to be a decker, but they often portray him as incompetent, and given just the serious tone of most of the game, it's just like, why would you keep this seemingly incompetent person around? So, in my opinion, I don't really like the way that was written, but the rest of the companions are very well done, and unfortunately, you will still need Blitz if you yourself are not a decker. In addition to these characters, depending on how you play the game, you might take on one or two more people late game, and I use the term people loosely, that can also potentially accompany you on missions. And in addition to all of those characters, anytime you leave for a mission, you do have the option to potentially take on other members of your team, but basically you'll have to pay them to do it in typical Shadowrun fashion, so you can mix up your team as necessary to get you through fights. Alright, so let's talk positives and negatives and then wrap this thing up. Positives, this game has vastly improved on Shadowrun Returns in basically every way possible. In addition to this, whereas Returns was a very straightforward and linear experience, Dragonfall really lets you have a great deal of player agency. There's a lot of choices in how you build your character, choices you can make in-game and how they affect the story, as well as, again, multiple endings. The negatives, on the other hand, are the waves of enemies that come, especially in missions, that go just on for way too long. They could have cut those by probably a third and then been in a good spot, but as it stands, some of those fights just drag on for far, far too long. And then the other negative for me was, again, a couple of the classes just see more representation in game than others. These primarily, again, being the Charisma and Decker. So anybody with those skills is probably going to see a lot more use than other characters, as being one of those two types of characters will see you just passing a great deal more of the game's checks than you would otherwise. And thus playing a high charisma character or as a Decker class will just be a more rewarding experience, frankly. And while you certainly don't have to play as one of those classes to get through the game or anything, it does at times almost feel like you're punished for not playing one of those two. But there you go, guys. There is my review of Shadowrun Dragonfall. To draw a conclusion before we wrap this thing up completely, you're unlikely to buy Shadowrun Dragonfall by itself. You will most likely buy it as a trilogy. I believe full price that trilogy is $55. However, you can often find it on sale for very cheap, but individually, Dragonfall is $15. So I will say outside of the trilogy, I think Dragonfall is absolutely worth $15. It's a great little CRPG, especially if you're just kind of getting into the genre. So if you happen to catch the trilogy on sale or you just want to buy Dragonfall individually, it's a great game. I think more people should check it out. Hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. We will be reviewing Shadowrun Hong Kong, the third installment in the series next. But regardless of all of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.